For many years now, Russ and Craig have had many wide-ranging conversations with folks from all over the gaming world. This is one of those conversations.
D6G, the Lost Chapter.
Welcome back to Dunkin' Donuts.
Maybe.
Look at that guy Craig. There's a guy in the corner wearing a plaid hat.
Man, what is up with people in hats nowadays?
It's very common, but
does he have a kilt? I can't see.
No, but I think that's Colby from Plaid Hat Games. Hey, Colby, how's it going, man?
Oh, hey guys, good to see you again.
What are you enjoying there in the corner?
Oh, I'm here having my moo latte.
Moo latte. What is your favorite flavor of moo latte?
It's got to be mocha, man.
I think that's a good call.
Mocha iced coffee myself.
Yeah, nice. Now, Colby, it's great to talk to you again. And we just met recently at PAX East there not too long ago. Jeff Engelstein asked us both to be on a panel. And so we were on this PAX panel. Do you remember the title of this panel, Colby?
No. It was the impact of video games on board game design.
Yeah, I think that's right. That sounds right. It was long. Jeff named it. So, we'll give him credit for that. And going into this, so we're gonna include the entire. We have the audio. It's about 50 minutes or so of audio from this panel. We thought we'd put it on here for you guys, and also I thought maybe give a little intro here to what our thoughts were going into this thing and some of the fun. Colby, what did you feel about it when Jeff first asked? Hey, do you want to be in this panel? What were you thinking?
I mostly felt pretty dang honored. Jeff is a well-known figure in the whole board game scene, and he's always really eloquent on his presentation of ideas, and the idea that he wanted me to be on a panel with him made me feel pretty good about myself.
Yeah.
And I, we do a podcast over at Plaid Hat Games, and so I do quite a bit of speaking on the idea of game design and just public speaking and that. So yeah, I mostly just felt pumped.
Yeah, it's awesome. And it went, and same thing happened with me. Jeff asked me to moderate, and I was just like floored. I'm like, really? With these guys? And it was like, you and Chris from Sentinels and Multiverse and Matt and all these other guys on there. I was like, these guys are awesome. I'm just some dude in New Hampshire making a podcast, So
you did a fantastic job moderating.
Oh, thank you, Colby. It was very nice. And then it was just sort of coming up with the ideas. So we're like, I don't know. And so we just kind of started collaborating on it. It was a lot of fun, and it turned out to be a blast. And the other thing I was nervous about was, is anybody going to show up, right? Because it's Saturday morning.
Me and you both.
10 o'clock Saturday at PAX East. I'm like, first of all, it's early, and everybody's up to like 2 in the morning Friday night before.
10 o'clock Saturday. We're at a video game convention.
Right, talking about board games. And I don't know, how did you feel when you saw that? There was actually a line waiting to get in, right? I was like, holy crap.
Yeah, it floored me. Like, I was... right up until I walked in and saw that crowd, I was convinced that there were going to be about 6 people.
That's what I thought for sure too. I was like,
and that it was going to be there were going to be about as many people as were on the panel, and it was going to be a little embarrassing.
Yeah.
Like, I was convinced of that right up until I walked into that room.
I felt the same when I was like, oh crap. When I saw the line, now it wasn't like, some of the PAX lines are like, they go forever and you can't get in the room. It wasn't that. There were plenty of seats left, but it was probably, I don't know what the capacity there was, but I felt like we had between 100 and 200 people in the room.
Yeah, we had
maybe closer to 200.
We had plenty of people.
Yeah, it was fun. And look, I was just really floored that many people came to listen, and we had great reactions. People seemed to really like it, so it was good times. Craig, you had a chance to listen to the audio.
I did.
And how did it feel people are about to listen to this audio. Should they spend 50 minutes of their life listening to this audio? Is it intelligible?
I think
What's Craig gonna say? You're putting him on the spot.
I'm just setting them up. Right. This is how I do it.
Just trying to manage expectations.
Right.
Or he's speaking ironically. Well, no, I think it's a very interesting topic, or they wouldn't have asked you to do a panel for it in a big, giant video game convention. And I found it interesting. I did. And it's quite a panel that they put together there for you. And so you're getting multiple. So is it worth it? I think it is, because not only are you getting Colby, the next 3C for the next episode of the show, you're getting a whole panel talking about this. So, and I think it's interesting, especially considering Colby's news of the new BioShock Infinite game that Plaid Hat has put together. So
did that come up on the panel? I don't
No,
recall.
but there's a very funny, ironic moment on the panel I want you to listen for.
Yeah.
When I mention, the question I ask is, have you ever thought about advertising in the way that video games advertise? And in my head, I was thinking like Minecraft, like, low budget, getting it out there virally. And Colby has this great line where he says something like, I can't imagine having the kind of budget that a video game company has to advertise a game.
I think I said like, when I see how a video game is advertised, it makes me feel like a less significant human being.
Right, which is a great line.
They're just, you walk that hall at PAX and it's just, everything is so big, it's so loud and so expensive. Like, how do they do it? How do
and
they
then the
pull
best
this
part is
stuff off?
now that you know about the BioShock game, the irony of that line, because the next episode you're going to hear us talk about Colby saying, well, there's great TV shows advertising BioShock, which also advertises my board game. So see, there it is. He's leveraging the wave. That's how brilliant the man in the plaid hat is right now. He's leveraging the wave of video game advertising.
I'm a surfer on a mighty wave.
You are indeed, sir.
It's bound to crush me.
You are now the big kahuna of game surfing.
Yeah, but I think it was very interesting to me, and I was also feeling all glum because I wasn't at PAX, so it was a way to kind of vicariously experience that also. But no, I absolutely think that it's an interesting topic, and I think it's cool to have. I mean, a bunch of those guys on that panel. You'll recognize them from. If not here, from other games and other places around the industry, and I think it's very cool. It's very cool that Russ was asked to do it. It's very cool that Colby was on the panel as well, and it's very cool the way they kind of weave it all together. And it's because it's sort of a philosophical design conversation. It's I think a lot of interesting things come up.
So there you go. Without further ado, here is the 2013 PAX panel called something about video games influencing board games, something or other. Good. Thank you for coming to our panel first on Saturday at PAX East 2013. That's pretty exciting. Yeah. I know it's really early. So who went to bed before 11 o'clock last night? Anybody? So for the audience participation, you're it. Because everybody, who went to bed before 1 o'clock last night? That's pretty good. Who was up after 1 o'clock last night? That's what I'm talking about. Make sure you had some coffee, hopefully. There's not much audience participation. We should be good. So today's panel, we're going to talk about the impact of video game design techniques on board games. Yes, it was named by an engineer. I blame him. Really excited about the panel today. My name is Russ Wakeland. I'll be the moderator. I am the co-host of the D6 Generation podcast. And starting to my very, very far left here, we have Matt Morgan. And Matt, of course, is a gaming journalist. And he comes to us from, he's Wired's Geek Dad, as well as he's co-host of the Boardroom's YouTube show. Right?
Yep.
Next to Matt, we have Jeff Engelstein. Jeff is the designer of such great games, the president of Mind Bullet Games, and has designed such products as the Ares Project, as well as the very popular Space Cadets. And he's an upcoming project called Space Cadets Warp Duel, whatever that is. So hunt him down later and ask him about that.
It's in my backpack, so there you
go. And also, of course, he's a co-host of Ludology and a contributor to the Dice Tower podcast as well. To my immediate right, we have Christopher Bedell. And Christopher is designer of a game you might have heard of called Sentinels of the Multiverse. There you go. Got a few fans out there.
I paid them extra.
Nice. And of course, he's the design director of Greater Than Games. And they've got a great booth over there as well. And to my very far right, the man in the plaid hat is, guess who? Colby Dauch from Plaid Hat Games, designer of Summoner Wars, and the president man behind Plaid Hat Games and all their great products. But first, kind of this whole concept of how do video games influence board games is kind of an interesting concept for me personally, because I kind of think the whole thing's come full circle. I was a video gamer back in the early 80s. I'm going to date myself now. And when I first played video games, they were all based on board games. The very first video games were all hex-based. Remember those SSI games, like Panzer General and all that stuff? And then came the RPGs, which were all totally based on Dungeons & Dragons. You had your Wizardry, your Ultima, your SSI gold box games, Pool of Radiance, all that stuff. That's all very old school, but it was all your computer games, board games. And now, some 20, 30, or unthinkable number of years later,
it's gotten to the point where many of the game designers and, of course, most of the young gamers now have all grown up on video games, and they're being introduced to board games after that. And so we thought it'd be kind of interesting to talk today with designers and people in the industry and find out, well, how is that affecting how people design board games, how designers think about board games, and what kind of mechanics and other influences come into board games from video games. So let's start off with you, Matt. I'll ask you a question here.
Sure.
And then we'll open up the rest of the panel. When designing a game, does the fact that the market now is so influenced by video games and brought up on video games, does that you think that really impacts how board games are designed now?
There's definitely an impact there, because if you look at the strategic depth of a game, how much thought do I have to put into it? You have to start with that base fact that a video game has that computer to do all your calculations and all your bookkeeping for you. So if you want to have a deep thinking game, you have to go for depth, not complexity. And what I mean by depth is the few meaningful decisions that you make are few, and they are very meaningful. It's not, I'm going to configure 100 inventory items and they all tweak me just slightly so, because I don't want to sit here and do all that math. I want to have a few impactful moments in the game that, have a real effect on how I play, not constant tweaking.
Anybody else want to chime in on that idea?
Good. I find it hard to kind of separate the customer raised on video games from myself, because I was raised on video games, love video games, and so and any game I'm designing for me first, because I imagine there's more me's out there. And so it's just a nature of, I'm going to build what I like, and I feel like I'm right in the demographic.
Yeah. I think a lot of really good board game design comes from treating it sort of like you're designing a video game, and those things come hand in hand, where when I'm writing a deck of cards or a game or any sort of prototype sort of thing, I'm programming AI. I'm writing a thing that should work on its own, and then the player interfaces with that, and instead of pushing buttons, you're turning over cards or moving chits or whatever, but you're still interacting with a thing that has been written in advance, and it's not dissimilar, it's just the medium, not necessarily the interaction. And it should still, you should still have the same sort of enjoyment and fun that you get out of it, but it's just in a different sort of physical setting. So,
yeah, I think that one of the key things that the gamer today is expecting, based on video games that you could not get away with before, is that ease of entry. I mean, there's Back in the, it might have been older than you are. So way back in the day, video games actually used to come with these thick manuals that you would read through. And
cloth maps.
Tell us
yes, cloth maps and silver ankhs and all kinds of good stuff. And that was part of what it was. I mean, the first Civilization game that came out from Sid Meier had a lot of background material. And the fact that it had the in-game Civilopedia was a real breakthrough on that game. And with board games, that came from board games. I mean, board games, you had, Advanced Squad Leader and all the big games that would take a long time and people would, take the time to learn and get into. And now with video games, I mean, the expectation is that you're going to be able to sit down and the game will walk you through that initial stuff, whether it's XCOM, which is a very complex game, but it steps you through that process and builds it up. And, people don't have the patience anymore to do that in a board game setting. And so I think that designers have had to adapt to that with a couple of different techniques, some of which have been used by some of the designers up here. My personal favorite is the information hiding and keeping the complexity of the game constrained in such a way that people only have to deal with it when they do. And the big way to do that is with a card game. I mean, if you look at Sentinels of the Multiverse, or you look at Summoner Wars, both of those have a lot of complexity going on in them, but because the players only have a hand of 5 cards or whatever it is, and that's what they have to deal with, and the information and the buildup of it kind of happens gradually. So I think that's one of the techniques that's involved in doing that.
Great. Well, a couple people mentioned mechanics and theme, and I think one thing I want to follow up on something Christopher mentioned, which was the idea that you're building AI, and I think one thing that's been happening a lot in the video game industry, and it really started maybe in the early 2000s when games like Halo and later Gears of War really started making co-op gameplay like a really part of video gaming, right? Before then, online play was really just death matches, and then all of a sudden it was, I want to play online with my friends together against the machine. We've also seen, of course, an explosion really in the last 4 or 5 years in board games with a co-op mechanic as well. And Christopher, is that Sentinels of Multiverse is obviously a co-op game. Has that come from video games? You think that idea of that?
I think it partially comes from video games. I think that what it comes from is in video games or in board games or in family games or any sort of games. People we're at PAX. People like gaming together. And whether that gaming together is versus each other or with each other under the same goal and all those different things, I mean, these are all just different ways to game together. And if you look at the way that games have evolved, even the games that are competitive nowadays, there's more of I'm not just playing against another faceless person. You really interact more and more with other people. The more everybody, excuse me, it's more early. Everybody makes comments about, gamers, antisocial, blah, blah, blah. Whereas gaming is getting more and more social and more people connected. And so cooperative gaming just tends to be, with so many different great competitive games, both in video games and in board games, I think that this kind of swing of cooperative games in video games and in board games is coming from we're all used to kicking each other's butts all the time. And when you have a really good experience, a really rich, dynamic experience where you're on the same team all together working against a common enemy of some sort, it's a really cool experience, a really kind of uplifting experience, whether it be in whatever medium. And so yes and no.
The video game, they have the whole CPU AI to handle all the characters and stuff. It must be a lot more challenging to make co-op in board games. What are some of the ways you've come over? Do you get informed in the mechanics in that way, or?
And that's kind of what I was talking about with the building AI. Is what I set out to do is running a thing that. For those of you who haven't played Sentinels of the Multiverse, the way that the game runs itself, the way the villain runs itself, is you just turn over a card off the top of the deck and do what it says. So essentially, that's not that dissimilar from what a computer game does when it's running. Your opposition is it says, okay, if-then statements. If this happens, do this. And that's exactly what you can do in a board game setting. And I never really intentionally approached it and said, I'm just going to program this villain AI. But I just started writing a deck, and then I started making it run itself. Then I realized, I'm doing this the hard way. And it really comes from making sure that, like Matt talked about, you want your choices to be few and meaningful.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing you want your AI, you want the game to do, is you want the actions it does to be meaningful. If it does a thing and it doesn't have any meaning, it doesn't mean anything to you in terms of mechanics, and it doesn't mean anything to you in terms of theme. If it's not hitting you on those levels, it's not actually doing anything. I mean, obviously, but you want to have as long as the things that you are doing as a player are meaningful, and the things that the game itself is doing to you and around you are meaningful, then the interaction is rich. And so that's the goal. It's not always achieved.
Yeah, Chris, I think Chris has really hit on something with Sentinels of the Multiverse as far as using co-op if your market is, people who grew up on video games and enjoy video games. And Russ, you mentioned it as far as video games have transferred to you play online, you play in separate houses across long distances. If video games have inspired this co-op boom, it's really only through negative example. Video game co-ops probably peaked in 16-bit era, Toe Jam and Earl, and it's been downhill ever since. But once everyone's spread out and you don't play on the same couch anymore, people, when they see each other, maybe that competitive go for the throat urge isn't quite there because we're finally seeing each other in person. So let's sit down and do something cooperative, and let's actually just sit at the table, play a board game. So there is an inspiration there, but it's not because video game co-ops are so great. It's because, video games have lost the right to say they inspired co-ops.
I think that when you're talking about the co-op AIs, there's a couple of different ways to approach it. And when we were doing Space Cadets, initially we tried some, which is all the players are piloting a spaceship. There's a starship crew, and the enemies are all out there and come after you. We originally tried to build more intelligence into the enemies. They had their own maneuver cards, and you drew a maneuver card that would do them, and just as we went through it, we just kept simplifying, again, because of the ease of entry, but also because we realized when the players were going that, the tricky part with doing an AI in a board game is dealing with the uncertainty. You don't want it to just be a completely solvable puzzle. So there has to be some uncertainty that's involved, whether it's flipping over cards like in Sentinels or rolling dice like in Mice and Mystics. And what we realized is that there was enough uncertainty in Space Cadets with how the players were maneuvering their ship, because you have to do everything in the 30-second time period and people screw up left and right, that was where we wanted the focus to be of the randomness, in essence, was the player actions. And so by making the enemies very, very straightforward, it gave the players' actions more meaning, because you could say, okay, because we were trying to maneuver to this square, because we failed to maneuver to this square, we know exactly how badly we're going to get nailed. Whereas, if you do it and there's just some kind of random element that takes some out of it. So you don't want to make it too random, so that the players don't have any sense of control, but you need to kind of find that sweet spot between, having just strictly puzzle, and some of the early co-ops that came out there were extremely, very much solvable puzzles, versus, something that has more excitement and player engagement through the element of randomness.
I think ultimately co-ops are just adding variety to the scene. Sometimes I want to play a game where it's me matched up against you, and I won, I defeated you, I overcame you, and because there's no greater AI than another human brain. But it's also really fun to come together and be able to high five one another when you together overcame this adversity. And in particular games like a Space Cadets or like a Mice and Mystics or Sentinels of Multiverse, that theme supports it so well. And co-op was just the only way we could do it and tell this theme the way we wanted to have this theme feel, And I think co-op, Matt mentioned the co-op is not a new thing to video games, and I think the co-op boom really comes from just the technology of being able to more easily connect with one another. And I think that we're all gamers. Video games, board games, we're all gamers. And so when something like that happens and impacts kind of the groupthink of gamers, it's going to bleed into all sorts of games. I think that's what we're seeing with the dual boom, so to speak.
Right, but I think one of the things that's going to be coming out more and more, and I think you're starting to see this, and that's when we talked about Warp Duel that we tried to capture, is this team versus team thing. I think when you look at League of Legends and Dota and stuff like that, I think there's, it makes a combination of having that co-op social feel where you can get 3 or 4 or 5 people playing together, but at the same time, you're playing against a much more challenging enemy. So I expect to see that as a trend coming out of more team versus team. We've seen a lot of the one kind of dungeon master overlord player like Descent versus a lot of players acting together where they try to bypass the AI. But another way to do that is evenly matched teams, which we haven't really seen as much, and I expect over the next year or two is going to become more popular.
I think Jeff has started to explore into time-based stuff, and I think that's going to be important when that starts to become popular in board games.
Yes.
Because Summoner Wars has a team game, and some people love it, some people hate it. And it's just because once you start talking teams and board games, we're sitting here looking at each other's hands and we're discussing strategy, and a game that should have maybe been twice as long as the 2-player game is 4 times as long. And board games can really outstay their welcome when they do that.
Yeah, sure. Well, you mentioned competitive there, Colby. Let's follow up on that a little bit. So, as gamers, we like a lot of variety. I often say on the show that a miniature war game will not succeed unless there's at least 4 factions. I think that's true in a lot of different games. In our video games, Orcs versus Humans was great, but StarCraft was even better because it had 3 whole factions. That's amazing. And now with board games too, the same is true. And in video games, a big part of that is game balance. Summoner Wars is a great example. Colby, you guys have, I don't know, how many factions now in Summoner Wars?
16.
16 different factions to play and fight each other with. How do you look at, because playtesting in board games is obviously challenging and different from video games a little bit, but how do you guys manage that balance, and do you take any cues from the video game industry and how that works?
Yeah, I think variety, people fall in love with it. Why? Because once I've gotten this system and understood it and have become proficient at it and enjoy it, then I can, variety just lets me enjoy it in new ways and keeps it fresh without the relearning process of a new game, and you know, I don't know, people dig it. It's clear. Like Cosmic Encounter is so much variety in a box, and it gets so much praise for it, and I think deservedly so. And I think that it does become a challenge, but it's a challenge to relish because you know that you have that fan base out there that wants it, and they're encouraging it, and they're cheering you along as you're doing it, and that's a great feeling. So it does, as you expand it, you know, play testing becomes more and more rigorous. But like I said, you know, you can build things into it that help, and Summoner Wars does that with the faction system, and you know. Magic, I can't imagine Magic playtesters how much work that they have to do and still get it wrong and have the ban cards, and you know, with Summoner Wars, by dividing it into factions, okay, now we have some control over what the matchups are going to be, and but at this point we're working on second Summoners, so we're going and revisiting each faction with a new deck, and that has proven to have some challenges because, you know, we're adding to the pool of what can be by quite a bit doing that.
If beyond, you know, just game balance when adding variety, I think there's a lot of pitfalls that can cause it to become, you know, not I love variety, but now I'm scared of variety.
Yes.
You know, as the only guy on this row that hasn't designed a game, I'm going to try to speak from the, you know, industry trend market perspective. Too much variety will trigger the OCD that a lot of the people in this room probably have as far as games. I'm at the point when I see a game where there's 8 promo packs, there's all these extra Kickstarter bits that come in the box, and there's 5 expansions. I can't deal with it. I don't want to have to go buy it all. Where am I going to put it? Which version are people actually going to want to play with? Are we going to have a fragmented player base now? If you're trying to, you know, draw lessons from video game design and incorporate them into a board game, try to add in that modular variety where maybe it's just, you know, an extra mission, kind of like a DLC mission, that you add that in, it replaces a piece of the core game rather than adding more and more bulk to the game. Because we talked about time before. You said games could overstay their welcome. If variety adds to the game and expands it, well, now you're setting it all up. Now you're going back to the 4 different rule books. Now you're breaking it all back down. All of a sudden, that's the only game you had time to play tonight. And now left a bad taste in your mouth, you're probably not going to want to play it next time.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And I think that a lot of that comes from, I mean, to talk about the variety and the time aspect, you know, Winston Churchill once said that a change is as good as a rest. And it's absolutely true, where do you want to play one 8-hour game, or do you want to play 4 2-hour games? 4 2-hour games, like, okay, that seems reasonable, but after a long enough amount of time of playing the same game, and it just, you know what's happening and you know what's going on, and you're like, this is just an exercise in futility.
I lost in hour 1.
Yeah, right. And, that's why I don't like player elimination. But so giving more options without increasing the overload of things, and yeah, what Matt was talking about, we're making sure that if you're adding something, you're not adding something and adding to the stack, but rather you're swapping something out. It makes a big difference. But in terms of balance, I think a lot of things, both in video games and in board games, worry a lot about balance to the exclusion of variety, where they'll say, okay, everything now is balanced. And oftentimes that means, okay, everything is functionally the same. To talk about video games, if you look at a lot of the changes that have gone through with games where people all play together and all move their stats around together, World of Warcraft has gone through a ton of different builds where they'll say, okay, now all these classes work like this, and every time there's a big change, there's an outcry of, well, now all the classes work the same, and then things change and things change. And this happens a lot in board games where you have things where people are, you know, working their decks together, but if they're making like a Magic deck or something, and they say, okay, well, now this new set is really well play tested and it's really well balanced, and then the variety actually isn't as much there anymore. And so you have to walk that line between balance and variety. And those two things aren't necessarily at odds with each other, but they're not always tangential.
Right. But as a game designer, I mean, that's one of the advantages of designing a co-op that makes it easier. Is there really isn't a balance issue with co-ops, because you can just put in your latest instruction manual and say, this mission is level 4 difficulty, and you play with these people, it's level 1. So
unless you never win Ghost Stories.
Hey, Ghost Stories is totally winnable if you just don't put the bosses in.
Right, but you don't have to worry about it. But I think that's, you know, 2 very good points. I think one, you know, that talk about time, that's another impact that video games has had is, even a 2-hour game now is considered very, very long. I mean, a lot of people expect to be able to sit down and play a game in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. It used to be, again, back in the 70s with the original Civilization, Avalon Hill and those type of games that, those were 8-hour Diplomacy, there's 7-hour games, 8-hour games. And, maybe you'll play it at a con, but there's just not the market there for that anymore. And I don't think it's as much an attention span thing per se. I think it's just an expectation that people want to sit down, they want to get in and they want to get out. But in general, I mean, balance is very hard, and that's one big advantage that that's hard for the game designer because video games have kind of created that need for variety and expansions and DLC and all that stuff, and people expect now to have 100 summoners or whatever it is now in League of Legends versus however many summoners, 16 summoners in Summoner Wars. But it's much, much harder to balance a board game because once it's printed, it's physical. It's very, very scary to do it and to send it out there. I mean,
you can't just patch it.
Right, you can't just patch it. I mean, we were doing the Ares project, and that was our big, nightmare day after day was, we were going to send it out in the field, and, people were going to find the killer combination that we had missed in 2 years of messing around with it. Unfortunately, it didn't happen because not that many people played it, but but it's still. But and that's a big difference between board games, and I think, and in a sense, it's harder to play test in a board game than a video game. So it's harder to balance, and you've got to really commit to your balance, and it's harder to play test because I can't do a beta test or an alpha test and have Blizzard. How many years even did they play test StarCraft 2.4 or just Heart of the Swarm before it came out? I mean, that was a very, very long cycle, and they were constantly tweaking right up until the very end with the resources that they have versus the resources that the average board game designer and design company has. It's an unequal battle in that standpoint.
Yeah, you mentioned the day one patch. Unfortunately, I think that trend is coming into board games. How many games do you buy now and you got to go online to Board Game Geek and download the new PDF that replaces the rule book you just bought because there's missings or misprints. One thing, you mentioned the Ares project, Jeff, and I wanted to ask about this. I think there is not a huge trend, but a trend happening in board game design where board games are being influenced by video game theme. And I don't mean like Gears of War, the board game, or I mean more like, I feel as a game designer, I want to build a board game around a video game theme like the Ares project is to simulate a video game as an RTS. It's not licensed, but it is a video game RTS simulator. Or you have the game from Cool Mini or Not, Super Dungeon Explorer, which is specifically designed to simulate those great little handheld, Final Fantasy type dungeon crawl games. Jeff, is that trend really there? And what's the impetus or excitement for saying, hey, if you play this in a video game, you might like this as a board game, this form factor?
Well, I think that's part of it is just the marketing. Certainly if you go to somebody, if you say, if you like X, then, go ahead and buy Y. I think that's a very, very quick and easy way to do it. And because the video game market is, whatever it is, 10 times, 100 times larger than the board game market, there's much more familiarity with that. And it's again, the ease of entry thing. People understand certain concepts going through. I mean, like I had heard a rumor that, I don't know if it's true or not, that Fantasy Flight had gotten the license to League of Legends, but maybe that's not true.
Look at you starting rumors.
No, I'm just starting rumors.
You heard it here first.
But I mean, I think that, and I think there actually was a board game that was just released that has similar with like 3 lanes and, that whole kind of concept is coming out. And I think that people look to it and bring it back. And like you talk about the full circle, I mean, there was the Avalon Hill Tresham Civilization game, and then Sid Meier based his Civilization on that, and then there was the Fantasy Flight Civilization that was based on the computer game. So, I think they're always going to keep feeding back into each other. So I think it's inevitable.
I think people like playing, I mean, there are certainly trends in gaming, both in types of gaming and in genres and themes and that sort of stories. And if we see a lot of, oh man, people are really liking playing this kind of video game, well, then those board games are going to pop up, and vice versa. Although certainly there's more of a directional steal from the larger industry, of course. But a lot of it comes from you see the games that are coming out now that the theme of it may be something new or something more related to what's going on in video gaming, but that game, I mean, you could strip away that theme, reapply a different theme, and the mechanics of the game isn't necessarily something that is brand new. But then sometimes it is, like what you were talking with the League of Legends, where you have like the lanes and that sort of thing happening in a board game setting. And I've seen a lot of tower defense board games where they're trying to simulate that video game tower defense style setup on a board game. And I think that is both a good thing because designers are going, okay, here's a new thing, let's try to do this on the table and make that happen. And I think it's also a trap, not necessarily a trap that you should avoid, but a trap you have to be careful around, because a lot of designers go, great, we have our core mechanic, we know that we're going to have towers and shooties or whatever, and you get locked into that and you try to build a thing. You have your endpoint and you're working to your endpoint to the detriment of making it work along the way. So I worry about a lot of games that have that sort of, this game is being made to simulate a video game sort of experience. And that's a great starting point, but it's sometimes a trap of an ending point.
Yeah,
So.
I think a really good starting point for, looking at the video game to board game is consider the video games as two separate games: the mental game and the dexterity game. David Serlin is a really good example of taking Street Fighter, stripping out all of the button pressing and joystick dexterity, and only the head game of which moves am I going to perform. I'm putting that into the card game Yomi, which is just a really tight competitive strategy card game. A lot of people would even say games like StarCraft are more, or at least equal dexterity games more than mental games, because it's all about, how fast can I click and move my mouse around the map rather than what units I'm going to build. So if you take out that dexterity half, you have a real good design target to focus on. Make sure that you've pushed all the dexterity off and try to achieve that mental game in board game form.
Yeah. You can't do everything in...
What?
You seem to have given the floor kind of same thing.
I can't hear you. We're going to move on. We're going to keep going.
You can't do everything in a board game setting. I mean, when you take a video game and you adapt it, you have to strip stuff out, and you've got to focus on what you think is a core thing. I mean, that's what 3D Ages did, which obviously has very much lifted from Civilization, but he completely eliminated the map, and that was a critical change to make that game work. I mean, with a map, it wouldn't have worked. And same thing with Ares Project. We ended up stripping out the map. Like you said, with that was an excellent example with Yomi. So I think that you really, in a board game especially, you have to focus. I mean, video games, you can start adding in this and that and the other thing because there's less cognitive overload for the player. But in a board game, you got to pick and just focus laser-like on those elements that are going to give the player the experience that you want them to get out of the game.
I think in the board game industry, we're in this environment where the prevailing knowledge or wisdom is that we're not going, as board game producers, going to line our pockets with money. And so I don't think that those decisions to make this board game based on a video game comes from a cash grab mentality of, well, this is working in those video games, so let's get this on the board games. I mentioned earlier how, I'm a video game player, and so if I sit down to a video game and have an experience that is in some way unique, that may inspire, but what would this look like if we have people around a table looking at each other and engaging with each other, and then we take this concept that I really dug on over here and incorporate it in some way?
Yeah, I think the concept idea is really interesting. I'll never forget this. When we talked to Matt Wilson first, man behind Privateer Press, we said, what was the idea behind the focus mechanic, inside a War Machine? It's such a core mechanic. He said, it came from video games. It's mana. You're playing video games, and you're casting spells, and it goes down, and then it comes back, and you go down. And so the whole core mechanic of War Machine is based on a video game idea that he grew up with, and yet, if you looked at War Machine, you would not really think this is a video game. So you can get, I think there's little gems of ideas do come out of there, which is sort of interesting.
But mana from video games, a lot of that comes from a limited resource that you use in board games. So.
It is a full circle. One thing, I heard this, and I wanted to ask the panel in general this question. I've heard it said that, one of the things that makes video games unique, although I think it's broader than this, but sort of idea, is that when you solve a problem, your reward is a more difficult problem. You know, you see this a lot in iOS apps, right? You start off with a really simple Angry Birds. Oh, that was easy. And the next one you get for solve all that hard work is another harder Angry Birds level. You know, do we see these ideas in board games? Is that sort of, you know, Jeff mentioned sort of easing you into the game, which is sort of that idea. Do you guys see board games as another avenue for that kind of concept of you know, problem solving, taking from easier, getting harder and harder as the game progresses?
You know, as far as a series of decisions that get harder and harder, my favorite games have that, but there's a breakaway point where instead of the video game just being an increasing challenge up to the, you know, the hardest challenge of your boss fight, there's a point, you know, maybe this inflection 2/3 of the way through the game where someone has to make a decision. I'm done with hard challenges. Now I'm going to take all my hard work and start racking up, say, victory points. And then everyone sees, oh, he's going for the end game, and you all follow suit. So you split from that path of not a constant incline of challenges, but challenges to a point, and then the game shifts tone. And I think that's a big difference between video games and board games.
You know, in a competitive board game sort of setting where you're going for a victory points thing, that's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. I think that something that was mentioned earlier about like saying there's difficulty levels of things, specifically for cooperative games, you do get that where you, but not necessarily within a game, but within a greater, here's this type of game. And in this game you say, okay, well you can play it the easy way, you can play it the medium way, you can play it the hard way. I mean, you mentioned Ghost Stories, and Ghost Stories has an easy, difficult, and hard levels, which should be called hard, impossible, and why are you doing this? But you can play with various difficulties, and you can set up the game in different ways that give you different challenges. And the goal is, once you've beat it on easy, then the natural thing to do next is to play it on a harder difficulty. But it should be because it's fun to do that, and not because I must defeat them, you know. And so, and that's the challenge is something hard just because it's hard, like that's shitty. Like if something is hard just for the sake of this is difficult, I mean, that's easy to design. This card says we lose. Well, we lost, man. Shouldn't have turned that card over, you know. But you know, so making it challenging while still fun and rewarding. And what is the reward? And you know, there should be some reward and victory of the feeling of we overcame that great thing. And the higher the risk you have, the higher the challenge you have, the higher the personal reward of perseverance. And that's the same thing in competitive games, where the higher the stakes are in terms of what your opponent is doing, overcoming your opponent or avoiding that destruction, that's where your reward comes in.
I think competitive games can be really good at doing just that, where your reward is a more challenging reward, and that's just. If you really want to get into a competitive game, usually there's somebody else out there that's really into it, and you can go and you can find more and more challengers, and you know, kind of do that, and even in your own group, where that iron sharpens iron kind of principle, where we're both getting better and better at this, and we're both becoming a bigger and bigger challenge, trying to edge one another out, and that's something that's kind of always existed, I think, in competitive board games, just by their nature.
Oh, sure. Like, I mean, even if you're talking like, you know, card games, traditional card games with a 52 card deck, you know, there's a lot of things where people, within their own groups, if there's a group of 20 people that always play together, you'll see certain patterns emerge of like, oh, these are the strategies that are valued in this group, and then maybe somebody from that group of whatever game goes and plays with a different group, and they are either, you know, sometimes they're really much better than those other people, or sometimes they're like, oh wow, I didn't realize there's a set of strategies, or all those different things. So you get that, yeah, the iron sharpens iron, but also within realms of
you get groupthink. Yeah. We see that a lot in Summoner Wars. Yeah. Like you'll go online and you'll see a forum post about how the Fallen Kingdom are unbeatable. They're unconquerable. And then you'll see another forum post on the same internet website that says the Fallen Kingdom are worthless. They do nothing of any value. And almost all the factions have that duality of I can't make them work, or these guys are great, and it's groupthink. Yep. You know, a group will get into, you know, the idea of this person got really good at this, and everybody mimicked them, and so that faction is the best.
That happens in cooperative games too. I need to get a shirt that says "Ask me about Absolute Zero."
A couple of thoughts on that. I think again, this is an area where it's kind of fed back and forth. But certainly with the Eurogame revolution, starting with Settlers of Catan in the mid '90s and going forward from there, there's been a shift from Risk and Monopoly, scorched earth type games towards games where everybody is growing something. I mean, in Settlers, even if you lose, you usually end up better than you started off. You're building up towards something, all the way up to now, like the new game Suburbia, where you're building your little town and you can, affect people and, hurt people in various ways. But basically, you're building something. You're building an engine. You're building something, and people like ending up with something that's better than what they started out with. And then some games will. Probably the clearest example would be Descent, in like Descent campaigns, or even just a regular Descent mission, where your characters start out very low level, and then you build up and you get better and better equipment and better stats and things like that, and then the game has to try to match that or keep pace with that in essence. Whereas in a video game, a lot of them will have adjustable difficulty levels, or if you're playing Diablo and you get too far ahead of yourself, you can just stay in the same level for a while and just keep going and grind a little bit and get better equipment if you're having too much trouble. In a board game, you don't necessarily have that, unless you're playing against Russ in Descent, and then they just walk all over you.
Apparently they do.
There's a couple sides to your question, Russ, about how modern video games have grown to have these extremely long, hand-holding tutorials that teach you how to play the game, but the equivalent for that in a board game is these introductory modes or starting setups for a new player, and I just don't know if board games and card games really need that. Maybe I've got the blinders on and I'm too deep into the hobby, but rather than taking the whole time to play a tutorial mode of a board game, I'd rather the publisher give me a video tutorial I can pop up and have everyone watch for 10 minutes, or maybe just spend a lot of time and give me a really well edited and laid out rule book, so I don't feel like I need to play the baby mode version of the game before I play the actual game as it was intended. Really, probably the only genre that's really well suited for this is like the deck building genre, because having that suggested starting first time set of cards just feels kind of natural. It still feels like you're playing the real game, not a watered down version.
And I think that we see that both in board games and in video games, where there's people that want in board games and video games, the super handheld tutorial. Most video game tutorials have a skip the tutorial sort of thing, either if you've played the game before or if you're feeling cocky. And a lot of board games say, well, here's your starting setup. I recently was introduced to a new game that me and the other person playing it had never played before, and we started setting it up, and it was a huge amount of like an hour and a half times for setting the game up. And it said, now here's how you set up an introductory game. Like, if we're going to play this thing, let's just play the actual game. But it's there if you want it. And I don't think it hurts anything to have that tutorial.
Different ways people want to learn, so you might as well give them all.
Right.
I'm glad Matt came to the panel. We've all been talking about board games, and then Matt will tell us all about how we can make better board games. So it's kind of like a panel for us too, wherein we're coming to listen to him.
My consultant fee. Okay, I think all that Plaid Hat money, you can afford it.
Yeah, I think it's nice now. You talked about the intro and the tutorial modes. I'm starting to dig the board games that kind of do it like the better video games, where the tutorial level is really the first level of the game, so you don't really feel like it's a tutorial. You kind of get in the backstory, especially if it's like the third version of the game or whatever. Board games do that now too. Like they have especially co-ops, right? The little intro zombie side level, and then it gets harder and harder as you go on.
But I mean, you can do it in a game. I mean, not keep going back to this game for reasons, I guess. But the original Civilization. I mean, for those of you that never played the board game version, the Tresham game. I mean, you start that game with one piece on the board. That's it. You have one little tribe marker, and on the first turn, you have population growth, so you add a second one, and then you move them to an adjacent space, and then they grow. And after like 3 or 4 turns, then you have enough guys to build cities, and then once you start doing cities, then you can do trade. And that game, I mean, it's a 7 or 8 hour game, so it's a different thing, but it's very, very easy to get new players into that game because you start with a piece. And there are more modern board games that follow that same philosophy, but I think that there's ways to do it that don't need a special mission, that you just start people with something that's very, very simple, as opposed to having them have all the options, like Struggle of Empires, the Martin Wallace game. There's like 50 different things that you can select from on turn 1, and so it's very, very hard to get into it, whereas if you just have 1 or 2 items and then you grow from that, it's going to be much easier for the players to get their feet under them.
I will agree with you there, that it'll be easy for a player to get into it, but I would disagree that it's a fair thing, because like you said, it's in a 7 or 8 hour game, and I'm brand new to it, I'm going to lose.
Yes.
Because you know the game better, and I'm learning. I was like, okay, I got my one piece, and I got a second piece, and I'm building a city. Well, what are you guys doing? Why do you have assault rifles? What's and so, yeah, I've learned the game, but I just spent 7 hours getting stomped by my friends. So,
I think if I can rewind the conversation a bit, because I'm just catching up. Jeff was talking about the tendency to go from the scorched earth type of game, and that we're seeing more and more popular growth type games. And I think we're all just playing to this genetic built-in thing in us that's the whole reason why society exists, is because we're driven to see things built, and now we can games have provided us with the ability to do that in a microcosm, and it is incredibly satisfying. And I think that's kind of where that comes from.
Kind of going along with that theme, and I'm really curious, we kind of hinted around at this, but have anybody in the panel or know another designer who, for example, was stuck in a game design and then they played a video game and like that mechanic clicked as a way to get around that problem?
I've never designed a game. I did watch Storage Wars and want to turn it into a Euro game, but that didn't happen.
There's maybe something there. We'll have to see that.
There's something.
no.
All right.
Not really.
Throw it up there.
I'm sure it's happened, but I can't. I'm trying to pull up like a specific example in my life. I can't do it.
Breakthroughs usually happen in the shower, on the toilet.
Right.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing is
I
would say when I'm in my most, and I have a hard time speaking to what other designers do, because designer processes are sometimes shared but rarely. But if I'm stuck on something, I don't go to video games. I don't even go to other board games. I go to nothing. I'm gonna go chop lumber or something like completely unrelated in order to. So that's.
Chris actually chops lumber, not Minecraft.
Right. Well, Matt, you mentioned something before the panel, and I wanted to ask you about it. You had this theory that some of the really bad acting and voice acting in video games may have influenced the fact that we're more tolerant of tacked-on theme or very weakly themed board games. Can you elaborate on that?
That sums up the point pretty well, but this is actually inspired by a book written by Tom Bissell called Extra Lives. I don't know if anyone's read it. He had one really interesting chapter. There's a lot of dud chapters too. One really good one where he talked about Resident Evil and how, around 1996, Resident Evil really shook up the video game market. It did it with a lot of really interesting, new gameplay styles. It caused a lot of great tension. But on the other side, it had some awful, atrocious scripted dialogue, and then it was acted even worse. So it made people swallow the pill whole and say, people will still buy these games if we give them crap voice acting, as long as it's got interesting, game mechanics. And I'm not going to say that, Klaus Teuber, halfway across the world, saw that and said, I'm going to design Settlers of Catan. But around the same time, stuff like Resident Evil may have primed our minds to say, hey, maybe it's more gameplay than it is the window dressing. And then people were more tolerant of, angry, scowling German guy on every board game box with, the same loosely dressed theme, because there is a lot of really interesting, good game mechanics in there. Maybe we don't need the, all the window dressing.
But I think it's really...
It is coming around.
That goes both ways, though.
We've gone past that
right
phase.
now we've got... we started, in the 70s, there were so many games that were like just...
trading in the Mediterranean.
Well, no. Even before that, before they were all theme, and but there were no mechanics. They were absolutely horrible. Really
Absolutely.
Terrible games, all themed, like Talisman. Just I'll say
the original.
You can talk to Jeff afterwards if you're a big Talisman fan.
But then there was a pushback against that, which was focusing on the mechanics, and I think that there was a conscious effort to make them as seamless as possible, just to distance themselves from these other games. That these are not those games, and now. Now, which I'm very excited about, is you've got the marriage now of the theme and the components and the visual stuff with the gameplay. I mean, whether it's the X-wing game from Fantasy Flight, or any of the thousands of miniature-based stuff on Kickstarter. You look at Kickstarter. I mean, it's the minis-based games that are becoming popular, and those are going. And people are assuming they've got the gameplay to back up the nice figures, and most of the time they're right. So I think that the state of the art on game design has reached a certain point. We're at that, but I think that's why, it's almost like they talked about, kind of the golden age of games in the 90s with the Euro games, in the early 2000s with Puerto Rico and all that stuff, and I think we're seeing the next generation of that, but really with very themeful and exciting games. And
now we're getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah, we're absolutely getting the best of both worlds.
If I could go down a bit of a tangent, you're talking about where we're getting the best of both worlds in theme, and you talked about bad voice acting, and I just think this is a kind of cool place to interject that that's really one of the strengths of board games, is that the voice acting and all that's getting really good in particular video games, right? And they can play to that cinematic strength, but we have a strength there too that causes so many of you to come and play board games, even though you could have that cinematic experience if you wanted it. And that's that it's kind of limitless what we can do, because it's limited by your imagination. You're filling in the blanks. You're just like when you're reading, it's a book versus a movie. And books haven't lost their place in the world just because they invented a more visual storytelling medium.
Well, do you think like Mice and Mystics as a video game? I'm sure they're beating down your door for the rights.
Do I think of it as
no. Do you think that it would work better? Do you think it works better as a board game as opposed to as a video? Like if you had a single player Mice and Mystics type video game or whatever, would that?
I think it could.
Some of the charm of it?
I think it could work as a video game, but I think part of the charm is those little tactical pieces, sitting down with friends. I think people are really in love with the idea of it as a board game because it's so classic board game. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I think you have to take that back to the book versus movie example. Sure, it could have been a movie, but it's a book. You know what I mean? And it has its own strengths in being that.
Well, I think that you want to. I mean, I think one of the greatest downfalls of so many board games to really go off the charts here, or off the tracks for this panel. But one of the problems with a lot of board games that get turned into video games is that the best part of a board game, both mechanically and thematically and storyline and all that, is being in a group of people together, and we're all playing this game together, and there's table talk about strategy, and there's table talk about characters, and here's what I do, and here's what you do, and that is so cool. That is the best part of board gaming.
And there's talk afterwards about that time when.
That's the thing. Oh my god. Yeah, no, like that is, and so, and this is one of the things that I love seeing so much in group video game stuff that's happening, where people are experiencing, especially a lot of new interesting video games that are doing different sort of things, like Artemis and Joust, where they're really surpassing the technology. Wow, I'm going off tracks. Anyway, so yeah, that's exciting. What are you guys talking about?
Nice.
James? Cool.
Which is why I have to get used to when my kids are sitting alone at their rooms that they're playing with their friends, right?
Have you looked at, has anyone on the panel ever thought about looking at or seen, looking at way video games are promoted and thought about, that's a good way to promote my board game?
When I look at how video games are promoted, I feel insignificant as a human being. I can't do it. I can't match it.
Well, you could if you like robbed a bank.
Yeah.
Or something like this. Board games don't make that kind of capital, but you're saying.
I was thinking more like Minecraft, which was not bankrolled by a major corporation, right? It just sort of virally became popular.
Sure, I would say that most good board games are advertised very much the same way that Minecraft is, in that it's a really good game, and then people buy it and they say, "Oh my gosh, I bet this really good game. You should get it. And let's play it." And you get it, and then you play it, and then he goes and plays with somebody else, and that's how board games get advertised the best. Like that's just been the case for a long time.
We're in this weird place when you're talking advertising, because if I'm advertising a video game and I really believe in that video game and I have money, I can throw money at a commercial, right? On television, Tomb Raider looks really cool, I'll jump on Steam and buy it, or I'll go down to the Walmarts. If I put Summoner Wars on a TV commercial, people are like, that looks interesting. I have no idea how to buy that.
With the internet it helps, certainly. But people say, you could do some advertising and then people are interested, they could look it up online. Or you could just have a good online presence, and that does a similar sort of thing.
That's where we have to live, is the online, and that's online has been a huge part of the
and building community. I think the thing that video game advertising does very well, some of the most effective video advertising is community building. We'll note again that we're at PAX. The community of gamers, if I know 500 gamers in a gaming community and 300 plus of them like this game, that's pretty good. I should probably go check that out. And the same thing happens now that there's these great online board game communities and that is the best advertising, or one of the best. It's again person to person, word of mouth, but word of mouth has a lot more clout and reach with online communities.
Colby, you mentioned a guy would see a Summoner Wars commercial and not know where to buy it. As far as, from a blogging and journalism perspective, they wouldn't even know where to read about it a lot of the time because, BoardGameGeek.com is not the end and be all of the board gaming hobby. Specifically, if you look at all the people in tabletop free play at PAX, it's not the same crowd as, say, Gen Con, where everyone is so deeply into the hobby. Right. There are a lot of, fresh people to the hobby here, and board gaming doesn't really have any sort of professional journalism scene. We're not really sure if it can support it or not. So that video game marketing strategy, yes, the grassroots is fantastic, and it's probably the best bang for your buck for board games right now. But video games have the public relations to media to consumer process where things are more formally marketed and publicized, and buzz is generated through media channels. We have that with our inward-looking board game media, but there is really no outward-looking for new people that are new to the hobby. And at some point, the video game, news scene may pick up the tabletop gaming scene. You're seeing it on Kotaku has a board game writer now, and obviously, Penny Arcade Report writes the occasional board gaming post. But until we get to there, it may just be too hard. The barrier of entry is going to be too high for board game publishers to enter this massive PR media chain that the video game industry has set up.
There are some things you can do, to kind of support of our marketing, similar to video games. And video games have demos that you can download. You can make print and play versions, and Serlin has done a good job with that. With their games, they always have print and play versions that you can just get. And I guess I could potentially see that as, putting something like that on Steam as an outlet. You just download the PDF and you've got the game. I've seen some companies, which is easier to do now, it used to be to do actual online game where you can play a couple of moves, so like a little flash game or, HTML5 or something that you could put something on there so people could get a demo, feel for it, and then, from there decide if they want to pick up the game. I'm a believer in it. As much information about the game as possible. I'd rather have people buy the game that really know what they're getting and know what it is, and rather than just get it because they like this scowling European guy on the box. And
the conventions help that. Obviously, that's a place to demo. A lot of successful board game cafes or shops are getting good about showing people the games, learning the games themselves, and showing the people the games and. Yeah, so right. I think that's where you get the video game.
There's obviously an untapped market out there. You just look at tabletop. They're crossing over into these other people, and they put a game on there, and boom, they sell 30,000 copies. That obviously these aren't people that knew about the game all along and just decided to do it because of Will Wheaton. They thought, they obviously were just exposed to it for the first time. It's the first time that they're.
I make most of my life decisions because Will Wheaton.
That's good.
Just because Will Wheaton.
To your point, Colby, where do you order it? I wonder if that's partly why board games is such a huge success on Kickstarter, because it's sort of a place you can go search for board game and basically see a giant pre-order page of all these games coming out, and I can show up and take my money, just start throwing them at the things I want. Because there hasn't been a lot of companies to date that have done a lot of pre-orders. I know some have experimented with it, but I'm just curious.
Well,
that's why pre-orders were popular. It's hard to find the right place to buy it from.
Right. You just sent to clearinghouse. Well, we're almost out of time. We got about 5 minutes left. So thank you everyone for coming. I know they're going to make us clear the room right at 11. So if anyone wants to come up, say hi, ask some questions in person. We'd love to chat with you for a bit before we're over. So thank you again for coming and taking your Saturday morning. Yeah, outside, right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for purchasing a D6G Lost Chapter. Supporting the show helps it grow.
Talk a little bit. I'm dying. I can't breathe. He's dying. Roll him back into the water.
Good.